The dust cloud appeared in the distance like an approaching storm, but Clara Wilson knew it was nothing so dramatic, just her dreams falling apart as the wagon's back wheel cracked beneath her with a sound like the breaking of her heart. It was 1878, and the Arizona Territory stretched around her like an ocean of sand and scrub, beautiful but unforgiving, especially to a woman traveling alone. "Whoa, there," she called to her team of horses, pulling back on the reins as the wagon tilted precariously to one side. The animals snorted and stamped, sensing her distress as she climbed down, her blue calico dress swirling around her ankles. At 25, Clara had already weathered more storms than most women twice her age. The death of her parents in a fire back in Chicago had left her with nothing but a small inheritance and a burning desire to start anew. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like Providence a schoolteacher needed in the growing town of Seligman. She had corresponded with the town council, packed her meager belongings, and set out west with hope in her heart. Now, examining the splintered wheel with dismay, that hope was fading fast. She was still at least 10 miles from town, the sun was beginning its westward descent, and she was utterly alone in unfamiliar territory. "Just perfect," she muttered, pushing a strand of chestnut hair from her face. Clara wasn't one to surrender to self-pity, but the situation called for at least a moment of despair. She allowed herself exactly 3 deep breaths before straightening her shoulders and assessing her options. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn, heart pounding. A rider approached from the north, a tall figure on a chestnut stallion. As he drew closer, Clara could make out broad shoulders beneath a worn leather vest and a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. "Looks like you're in some trouble, madam," he called, his voice deep and resonant as he reined in his horse several yards away. "The wheel's broken," Clara replied, deciding direct honesty was her best approach. "I'm headed to Seligman." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion that spoke of a lifetime spent on horseback. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-30s, with streaks of silver at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. "Name's Ross Parker," he said, removing his hat briefly to reveal thick dark hair shot through with silver. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-bronzed skin. "My ranch is just over that rise." Clara introduced herself, watching as he knelt to examine the broken wheel. His hands were calloused but gentle as they moved over the splintered wood. "Can't fix this here," he pronounced after a moment. "Wheel's done for." He stood, dusting off his hands on his denim trousers. "My ranch is closer than town. We can shelter your horses there, and I've got a wagon to take you into Seligman tomorrow." Clara hesitated. Going with a stranger to his ranch went against everything she'd been taught about propriety and safety. Yet something in his steady gaze reassured her. This wasn't some smooth-talking charlatan. Ross Parker had the look of a man who'd earned every line on his face honestly. "I have a son," he added, as if sensing her reluctance. "Caleb. He's 10. We don't get many visitors, but you're welcome to stay until we can get you to town." The mention of his son settled something in Clara's mind. "Thank you, Mr. Parker. I accept your offer." They worked together to unhitch her horses and salvage what they could from the wagon. Clara insisted on carrying her own trunk, which contained her most valuable possessions, books, teaching materials, and the photograph of her parents that was her most treasured keepsake. As they crested the rise, Clara caught her breath at the sight of the Parker ranch spread out below them. It wasn't grand by any means, but the neat cabin with its stone chimney, the well-built barn, and the small corral all spoke of care and hard work. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods that rustled in the late afternoon breeze. "It's not much," Ross said, misreading her expression, "but it's ours." "It's beautiful," Clara replied honestly. After months of travel and years of city life before that, the modest homestead looked like paradise. A boy came running from the direction of the barn, all gangly limbs and curious eyes. He stopped short at the sight of Clara, his expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Caleb, this is Miss Wilson," Ross called. "Her wagon broke down on the road to Seligman. She'll be staying with us tonight." Caleb approached cautiously, tugging at his frayed shirt cuffs. "Hello, madam," he said with careful politeness that made Clara smile. "Hello, Caleb. Thank you for sharing your home with me." The boy nodded, then turned to his father. "I fed the chickens and collected the eggs like you asked." "Good man," Ross said, and Clara noticed how the boy straightened at the praise. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and what appeared to be 2 small bedrooms off to the side. A bookshelf held a surprising number of volumes, well-worn and clearly treasured. "You can take my room," Ross said, gesturing to one of the doors. "Caleb and I will bunk in his." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly but kindly. "My mother would haunt me if I let a lady sleep anywhere but in a proper bed." Clara smiled at that. "Thank you." As Ross prepared a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and venison, Clara found herself studying him. There was an ease to his movements, a quiet competence that she found compelling. But there was also a sadness, a stillness when he thought no one was looking. Over dinner, Clara learned that Ross had been on his own with Caleb for 5 years, since his wife Sarah had died of fever. He'd moved west from Missouri, seeking a fresh start where the land was cheap and opportunities plentiful. He ran cattle on his modest spread, enough to support himself and his son, with occasional work as a guide for survey parties to supplement their income. "And you're to be the new schoolteacher?" he asked as they sat by the fire after supper, Caleb reluctantly working through his reading lesson before bed. "Yes," Clara replied. "I taught in Chicago for 3 years before I decided a change was needed." Something in her tone must have conveyed her reluctance to elaborate, for Ross simply nodded. "Seligman's been trying to get a proper teacher for some time. The children have been making do with Mrs. Hollister, the preacher's wife, but she's expecting her 4th child and can't manage any more." "I hope I can meet their expectations," Clara said, a flutter of anxiety stirring within her. "Anybody who travels across the country alone to take up such a position is surely determined enough to succeed," Ross observed, and there was a warmth in his gaze that made Clara look away, suddenly self-conscious. That night, lying in Ross's bed, a strange intimacy that was not lost on her. Though nothing improper had occurred, Clara found herself thinking about the tall rancher and his solemn son. There was something compelling about their quiet life, about the bond between them that was evident even in their silences. And when she finally drifted off to sleep, it was with the unexpected thought that perhaps the broken wheel had been a stroke of good fortune after all. Morning brought the scent of coffee and bacon, and Clara emerged from the bedroom to find Ross already dressed and cooking at the cast-iron stove. Caleb sat at the table, carefully writing in a tablet. "Good morning," Ross said, glancing up with a smile that transformed his serious face. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Clara admitted. She'd grown accustomed to the discomfort of travel, to falling asleep with one eye open in strange towns and wayside inns. The security of the Parker cabin had allowed her a deeper rest than she'd known since leaving Chicago. After breakfast, Ross hitched his team to his wagon while Clara packed her belongings. Standing in the bedroom, she found herself running her hand over the simple quilt, noting the careful stitching that spoke of a woman's touch. Sarah Parker's, most likely. The thought gave her a strange pang. "Ready to head into town?" Ross asked when she emerged, trunk in hand. Clara nodded, though she felt an unexpected reluctance to leave. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Parker." "Ross," he corrected. "And it was no trouble." He hesitated, then added, "Maybe it was meant to be." Clara looked at him questioningly. "The wheel breaking near my land," he clarified, a slight flush creeping up his neck above his collar. "Caleb's been needing some proper schooling, and I've been wondering who'd be teaching in town. Now I know." It was a practical explanation, but something in his tone suggested more than mere practicality. Clara found herself smiling. Perhaps it was. The journey to Seligman took just over an hour, the wagon bouncing over the rutted trail as Ross pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area. Caleb rode his own pony alongside them, occasionally racing ahead and then circling back, his earlier shyness giving way to boyish exuberance. Seligman itself was larger than Clara had expected, a proper main street lined with wooden buildings, including a hotel, a general store, a saloon, and what appeared to be a newly constructed schoolhouse. People moved about their business, pausing to stare curiously as Ross's wagon rolled into town. "That's the school," Ross said, pointing to the white clapboard building with its small bell tower. "And that building next door with the blue shutters is the teacher's cottage. Town council had it built last year, hoping to attract someone permanent." Clara felt a surge of excitement. The cottage was charming, with a small front porch and what looked like a garden plot in the back. It would be hers, the first real home she'd had since her parents' death. Ross pulled the wagon up in front of the town hall, a two-story structure that also housed the sheriff's office. "Mayor Drummond's office is inside. He'll be expecting you." Clara gathered her skirts to climb down, but Ross was already there, offering his hand. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, and she quickly looked away. "Thank you again for everything," she said formally, aware of the curious eyes watching from the boardwalk. "My pleasure, Miss Wilson." Ross had reverted to formality as well, perhaps also conscious of the onlookers. But then he added in a lower voice, "Caleb and I live a fair piece out, but we come to town for supplies every couple of weeks. Perhaps we'll see you then." "I'd like that," Clara replied, and was rewarded with another of those transformative smiles. Mayor Drummond was effusive in his welcome, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and an expansive manner. "We've been waiting for you, Miss Wilson. When you didn't arrive yesterday, we feared something might have happened on the trail." "My wagon wheel broke," Clara explained. Fortunately, Mr. Parker was kind enough to offer assistance. "Ross Parker." The mayor's eyebrows rose. "Well now, he keeps to himself mostly since Sarah passed. Good man, though. One of the best trackers in the territory." Clara found herself wanting to ask more about Ross, but propriety held her tongue. Instead, she discussed practical matters: when school would start, how many pupils to expect, what supplies were available. By mid-afternoon, she was settled in the teacher's cottage, her trunk unpacked, her small collection of books arranged on the shelf by the window. The cottage was simply furnished but comfortable, with a sitting room, bedroom, and kitchen. The luxury of having running water pumped to a sink in the kitchen nearly brought tears to her eyes after months of travel. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as Clara prepared for the start of school. Parents brought their children to meet her, some suspicious of this city woman, others openly relieved that their offspring would receive proper education. Clara worked to win them over, one family at a time, listening to their concerns and sharing her vision for the school. She thought of Ross and Caleb often, wondering how they were faring on their ranch. The boy was bright but behind in his studies. She'd gleaned that much from his reading the night she stayed with them. She found herself planning lessons with him specifically in mind, wondering if Ross would indeed bring him to school. 2 weeks after her arrival, Clara was arranging books on the shelves in the schoolhouse when she heard the now familiar sound of Ross's wagon. Her heart quickened as she stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Ross pulled the team to a stop in front of the school, Caleb beside him on the seat. The boy jumped down immediately, clutching a book to his chest. "Miss Wilson," he called, his earlier reserve completely gone. "Pa says I can start school next week with the others." Clara smiled, genuinely pleased. "That's wonderful news, Caleb. I've been hoping you would." Ross approached more slowly, hat in hand. He looked different somehow, his hair trimmed neatly, his shirt newer than the one he'd worn when they first met. "Miss Wilson," he greeted her. "You're settling in well." "Very well, thank you." Clara was conscious of the warmth in her cheeks and hoped he would attribute it to the September sun. "The people here have been most welcoming. Glad to hear it." He glanced at the schoolhouse behind her. "Place looks good. You've been busy." "There was much to do," Clara admitted, "but it's coming along nicely. We start classes next Monday." Caleb had already disappeared inside, eager to explore. Through the open door, they could hear him exclaiming over the maps and charts Clara had hung on the walls. "He's excited," Ross said, a note of wonder in his voice. "Hasn't been this animated since, well, in a long time." Clara understood what he wasn't saying. Since his mother died. "He's a bright boy. I look forward to having him in class." They stood in awkward silence for a moment until Ross cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you might like to join us for supper at the hotel. To celebrate Caleb's enrollment in school and to thank you properly for being willing to teach him." Clara hesitated only briefly. Propriety dictated caution, but she was no longer in Chicago, and frontier towns had their own standards. Besides, they would be in a public place with Caleb present. "I would be delighted," she said. Supper at the Seligman Hotel was a modest affair by Eastern standards, but the food was plentiful and well prepared. Clara found herself laughing more than she had in years as Caleb regaled her with tales of ranch life, and even Ross seemed to relax, the stern lines of his face softening as the evening progressed. "Pa was a Texas Ranger before I was born," Caleb informed her proudly over apple pie. "He caught all kinds of outlaws." Ross looked embarrassed. "That was a lifetime ago," he said, "and I was never more than a junior member of the company." "Is that how you learned to track?" Clara asked, genuinely curious. Ross nodded. "Partly. Learned more from the Comanches, though. Spent some time with them as a boy." This revelation intrigued Clara, and she found herself peppering him with questions about his experiences. Ross answered thoughtfully, his initial reserve gradually giving way to a quiet eloquence that surprised her. As they walked back to her cottage after supper, Caleb running ahead to examine a stray cat on the boardwalk, Ross said quietly, "I haven't talked about those days in years, not since Sarah." He trailed off, then added, "It felt good. Thank you for listening." "Thank you for sharing," Clara replied. The evening air was cool, stars emerging in the darkening sky above them. "You've led such an interesting life." Ross chuckled, the sound low and pleasant. "Not sure interesting is the word most would use. Hard, maybe, lonely at times." The admission hung between them, unexpectedly intimate. Clara found herself wanting to reach out to offer some comfort, but they had reached her cottage gate. "Thank you for supper," she said instead. "I enjoyed it immensely." "As did we." Ross hesitated, then added, "Caleb and I usually come to town on Saturdays for supplies. Perhaps we could make this a regular arrangement. It would give the boy something to look forward to." The boy, Clara noted, not himself. But she saw something in his eyes that belied the casual nature of the invitation. "I'd like that very much," she replied. The first day of school arrived with 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 17 filing into the schoolhouse. Caleb was among them, scrubbed clean and wearing what Clara suspected was a new shirt, his hair slicked down with water. He took a seat near the front, practically vibrating with excitement. Clara had taught in Chicago, but frontier education presented its own challenges. Some of the older students came only sporadically, needed at home for chores or ranch work. Levels of previous education varied wildly, and there was a suspicion of book learning among some families that Clara had to work diligently to overcome, but she loved it. Loved the eagerness of the younger children, the reluctant interest of the older ones as she introduced them to literature and science. Loved the sense of building something lasting in this dusty frontier town. And she found herself looking forward to Saturdays with an anticipation that both exhilarated and frightened her. Each week, Ross and Caleb would come to town, and they would share a meal at the hotel. Afterward, sometimes they would walk along the creek that ran behind the town, or sit on her porch if the weather was fine, talking long into the evening while Caleb played with the other children or read one of the books Clara lent him. Through these conversations, Clara learned more about Ross's past, his childhood in Missouri, his time with the Rangers, his marriage to Sarah, a doctor's daughter from Austin. She shared her own stories growing up in Chicago, her parents' death in the Great Fire, her decision to come west. "Weren't you afraid?" Ross asked one evening in late October as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Traveling all that way alone, Clara considered the question. "Yes," she admitted, "but I was more afraid of staying. Of living the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd found the courage to leave." Ross nodded slowly. "I understand that. After Sarah died, there were days I thought about packing up, moving on, starting fresh somewhere no one knew us. But then I'd look at Caleb and I knew we needed stability, not more change." "You've built something beautiful here," Clara said softly. "A good life for him. I've tried." Ross's profile was limned in the fading light, strong and somehow vulnerable. "Sometimes I wonder if it's enough. If I'm enough." Clara's heart ached at the doubt in his voice. Before she could think better of it, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. "You're a wonderful father, Ross. Anyone can see that." He turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that took her breath away. They sat in silence as the first stars appeared, neither willing to break the fragile connection between them. The following Saturday, Ross arrived in town alone. "Caleb's down with a fever," he explained, his face drawn with worry. "Nothing serious, Mrs. Hollister says, but he needed to stay abed." Clara's disappointment at missing their usual meal was immediately overshadowed by concern. "Is there anything I can do?" "I have some books he might enjoy while recuperating." Ross smiled, the tension in his face easing slightly. "He'd like that. Actually, I was hoping. That is, Mrs. Hollister gave me a list of supplies from the apothecary, and I need to collect them and get back. But I hate for you to miss our dinner." Clara understood the unspoken invitation. "I could ride back with you," she suggested. "Bring the books for Caleb, perhaps make some soup. I'm not much of a cook, but chicken soup is one thing I can manage." Relief washed over Ross's face. "Would you?" "It's not proper to ask, I know, but propriety matters less than kindness," Clara said firmly. "Let me gather a few things and I'll be ready to go." The ride to the Parker Ranch was largely silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara found herself watching Ross's profile as he handled the team, noting the worried furrow between his brows, the set of his jaw. She had come to care deeply for both Ross and Caleb over the past weeks, more than was perhaps wise given her position in the community. At the ranch, she found Caleb pale but alert, his fever having broken earlier in the day. His face lit up at the sight of her and the books she'd brought, and she sat by his bed reading to him while Ross prepared a simple supper from the supplies they'd brought from town. Dusk was falling by the time Caleb drifted off to sleep, the book still open across his chest. Clara gently removed it, tucking the blanket around his shoulders before joining Ross in the main room. "He looks better already," she said softly, accepting the cup of coffee Ross offered. "Your presence is good medicine," Ross replied, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. He was watching her with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her veins. "I should go," she said, though it was the last thing she wanted. "It'll be dark soon." "Stay," Ross said quietly. "Please. It's too dangerous for you to travel back alone, and I can't leave Caleb." He gestured to the small sofa. "I'll sleep out here. You can take my room again." Clara knew she should refuse. Her reputation in town was still being established, and tongues would wag if it became known she'd spent the night at the Parker Ranch. But the thought of the long, dark ride back to town was daunting, and the simple truth was that she didn't want to leave. "All right," she agreed. "But only because it's safer." Ross's smile told her he understood the excuse for what it was. They sat by the fire, talking in low voices so as not to wake Caleb. Clara found herself studying the cabin in the firelight, noticing the small touches that made it a home: a handmade quilt draped over a chair, a shelf of treasured books, a child's drawing tacked to the wall. "You've made a beautiful home," she said. Ross followed her gaze. "It was Sarah's doing, mostly. She had the knack for it. I've tried to keep things as she would have wanted." "You loved her very much," Clara observed, hearing the lingering grief in his voice. Ross nodded. "She was everything to me when she died. I thought that part of my life was over. That Caleb and I would just go on, the two of us, and that would be enough." He looked directly at Clara then, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "I never expected to feel this way again." Clara's heart stuttered. "Ross, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "We barely know each other. And you have your position to consider. I'm not asking for anything, Clara. I needed you to know that you've awakened something in me that I thought was dead and buried alongside Sarah." Clara found herself moving to sit beside him, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "Not for what I feel." Ross's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as a whisper. "And what do you feel, Clara Wilson?" "Hope," she said simply. For the first time in years, when he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. A kiss that spoke of possibilities, of futures neither had dared imagine until now. The winter of 1878-79 was harsh by Arizona standards, with freezing temperatures and occasional snow that transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful. School continued through the worst of it, though attendance was sporadic when the weather made travel difficult. Ross and Caleb still came to town on Saturdays when the trails were passable. Their suppers at the hotel had become a tradition, one that the townsfolk observed with knowing smiles and occasional raised eyebrows. Clara found she cared less about the gossip than she might have once. Her position as teacher was secure. She had proven her worth over the fall months, and even the most skeptical parents had been won over by their children's progress. Christmas brought a special joy, with a community celebration at the church and a small, private exchange of gifts between Clara, Ross, and Caleb on Christmas Eve. Clara had knitted scarves for both of them, and received in return a beautiful leather-bound journal from Ross and a painstakingly whittled wooden bird from Caleb. "It's a mockingbird," the boy explained anxiously. Because you're always singing when you think no one's listening. Clara hugged him, touched beyond words by the observation. It's perfect, she assured him. The most beautiful gift I've ever received. Later, after Caleb had gone to bed, Clara and Ross stood on the porch of her cottage, watching snowflakes drift down in the light from the window. I have another gift for you, Ross said, his voice low. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver ring set with a single turquoise stone. It was my mother's, he explained. I've been carrying it since Sarah died, waiting for the right moment. Clara's breath caught. Ross, I'm not asking for an answer tonight, he said quickly. I know there's much to consider, your teaching position, the talk in town, and I wouldn't want to rush you. He took her hand, pressing the ring into her palm and closing her fingers around it. But I want you to know that whenever you're ready, if you ever are, Caleb and I would be honored to call you family. Clara looked down at the ring in her palm, then back up at Ross's face, so dear to her now, so essential to her happiness. Ask me, she said softly. Ross's eyes widened. Clara, are you sure? Ask me properly, Ross Parker. A slow smile spread across his face. He took the ring from her palm and knelt in the gathering snow. Clara Wilson, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Yes, I will. The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her all along. They were married in the spring, when the desert bloomed with wildflowers and the air was sweet with promise. The ceremony was small but joyful, held in the Seligman church with Caleb standing proudly at his father's side. Clara wore a gown of ivory silk that she'd ordered from a catalog and altered herself, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. The school board had agreed, after much deliberation, that Clara could continue teaching even after her marriage. It was an unusual arrangement, but practical given the difficulty of finding qualified teachers in the territory. She would teach through the week and return to the ranch on weekends and holidays. Are you sure this is what you want? Ross asked the night before their wedding as they walked along the creek behind the town. Living between two worlds like this, it won't be easy. Clara squeezed his hand. I want both, she said simply. I love teaching and I love you and Caleb. I don't see why I should have to choose. Ross smiled, lifting her hand to his lips. Then both you shall have, Mrs. Parker to be. Their first year of marriage was one of adjustments and discoveries. Clara learned the rhythms of ranch life, how to cook on a wood stove without burning everything, how to manage the household accounts. Ross learned to share his space and his decisions, to consider Clara's opinions and desires alongside his own. Caleb blossomed under Clara's guidance, excelling in school and growing more confident by the day. They established a routine. Clara would stay in town during the school week, then Ross would come for her on Friday afternoons. Weekends at the ranch were filled with chores and simple pleasures, fishing in the creek, reading aloud by the fire, star-gazing from the porch on clear nights. It wasn't always easy. There were arguments and misunderstandings, moments of frustration when their different backgrounds and expectations clashed. But beneath it all ran a current of deep affection and mutual respect that carried them through the difficult times. In the summer of 1880, Clara discovered she was expecting a child. The news brought joy tinged with practical concerns. How would she manage her teaching duties with an infant? The school board, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to a temporary replacement during her confinement, with the understanding that Clara would return the following term. We don't have to decide everything now, Ross assured her as they lay in bed discussing the future. His hand rested protectively over her still flat stomach. We'll figure it out as we go, the three of us, 4 of us, he corrected with a wondering smile. Clara covered his hand with her own. "I never imagined this," she admitted. "When I came west, I was looking for independence, for a place to build a new life. I never expected to find a family." "Maybe it was meant to be," Ross murmured, echoing his words from the day they'd met. "That broken wheel. The way you came into our lives just when we needed you most." Clara turned to face him, tracing the beloved contours of his face with her fingertips. "I think perhaps it was," she agreed. "All of it." Their daughter, Elizabeth Sarah Parker, was born on a crisp February morning in 1881 with Mrs. Hollister attending and Ross pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, evident from her first lusty cry. "She's perfect," Ross whispered, cradling her with a tenderness that made Clara's heart swell. "Absolutely perfect." Caleb approached the bed cautiously, peering at his new sister with solemn curiosity. "She's awfully small," he observed. "She'll grow," Clara assured him, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "And she'll need a big brother to look after her." The boy straightened at that, his chest puffing out slightly. "I'll teach her everything," he promised. "How to fish and ride and which berries are safe to eat." Clara exchanged a smile with Ross over Caleb's head. This was what she'd been looking for all along. She realized not just a job or a home, but this. A family bound by love and shared purpose. Clara did return to teaching when Elizabeth was 6 months old, bringing the baby with her to school. It caused some raised eyebrows at first, but the arrangement worked surprisingly well. Elizabeth became the unofficial mascot of the schoolhouse, adored by students of all ages, and Clara found that motherhood had made her a more patient, understanding teacher. The years passed in a tapestry of ordinary days and special moments. Caleb grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's tracking skills and his stepmother's love of learning. Elizabeth was joined by a brother, James, in 1883, and the family expanded to fill the cabin with noise and laughter, and occasional chaos. Ross continued to run the ranch, expanding their holdings as prosperity allowed. Clara divided her time between teaching and family, finding in the balance a fulfillment she'd never dared hope for. They faced hardships, of course drought years when the cattle suffered, illnesses that left them frightened and exhausted, the inevitable conflicts that arise in any family. But they faced them together, drawing strength from the bonds between them. On the 10th anniversary of the day they met, Ross surprised Clara with a gift, a new wagon wheel, polished and mounted beside their front door. "What on earth?" Clara laughed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "To remind us," Ross said, putting his arm around her waist, "of broken wheels and meant-to-bes, of how the worst day can turn into the best if you're open to the possibility." Clara leaned into his embrace, watching as their children played in the yard. Caleb, now 20, showing little James how to throw a lasso, while Elizabeth practiced her reading under the cottonwood tree. "I wouldn't change a thing," she said softly. "Not one single moment." Ross kissed her temple. "Nor would I, my love. Nor would I." In later years, when their hair had turned gray and their grandchildren played where their children once had, Ross and Clara would sit on their porch in the evening light, his hand covering hers just as it had that first night. They would watch the desert sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, and remember how a broken wagon wheel had led them to each other, how a chance encounter had changed the course of their lives. "Maybe it was meant to be," they would say to each other, and smile at the familiar words that had become the cornerstone of their shared story. Because in the end, that's what their life together was, a story of love found in the most unexpected place, a family forged through choice and commitment. of a happiness neither had dared hope for until that dusty afternoon on the trail to Seligman. And in that story, the broken wheel was never truly a misfortune, but the beginning of everything good that followed the first page of a tale that would continue long after they were gone, in the lives of their children and their children's children. A legacy of love that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a lonely stretch of road in the Arizona Territory, where a weary traveler had found not just shelter for the night, but a home for a lifetime.